according to your own recollection, after reading the deposition testimony, did you come to the understanding that Mr. Tolson told a nurse in the examining room that his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling in his foot?
Objection.
And my answer is he told everyone that came into his room that he
So
had
is that a yes?
That's
According
a yes.
to his testimony.
Yeah, according to his testimony, he told everybody that he had a cold foot and numbness in his foot.
Now, if one of those nurses was Nurse Stell, I think you testified that Nurse Stell would have the obligation to make that complaint known to a physician's assistant or a physician. Is that true?
Objection. You have restated her testimony, and again, you are replowing questions that you have already asked her.
She can tell me if I got it wrong. She's got a voice.
Okay, Ms. Halstead, then you have to be very careful and answer the question based on any point in time that these things occurred, according to Mr. Tolson's own testimony. Because I think your answer changes depending on when these things happen. So, you know, which is what you've already testified to.
Go ahead, Ms. Halstead. You can answer my question.
If Nurse Stell heard the complaint from Mr. Tolson that his foot was cold and numb just before P.A. Shaw examined the patient, Nurse Stell was not required to discuss it with P.A. Shaw until she had examined him. And at that point, in many times you collaborate with the doctor. The nurse examines the patient, then the doctor examines the patient, and then you may collaborate with them and discuss, well, what did you find?
And if Mr. Tolson had told Nurse Stell that his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling, after he had finished the examination with Nurse Shaw, right before he was ready to be discharged, would then...
P.A. Shaw.
You're right, P.A. Shaw. Would then Nurse Stell have to then report his cold foot and that he had no feeling in his foot to either P.A. Shaw or Dr. Jackson?
Objection asked and answered. You can answer it again, ma'am.
At discharge, you're referring to?
Right, after he'd already been seen by P.A. Shaw.
Are you referring to in the early part of his stay or at discharge?
No, ma'am, this is going to go right to before he was wheeled out, okay?
Okay.
Okay, now, if after Mr. Tolson saw P.A. Shaw has approved his discharge, and he's in the examining room waiting to be wheeled out, and he told Nurse Stell at that time that his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling, was Nurse Stell required to bring that complaint to either P.A. Shaw's attention or Dr. Jackson's attention?
Objection asked and answered. You can answer it again.
And the answer is no.
Why not?
Because he complained of the same subjective symptoms several times to many different medical staff. That was not a change in his complaint. Therefore, and also Nurse Stell examined the neurovascular status of his foot before he left. And if there would have been an abnormality, she would have contacted the physician before discharging him. That is her testimony that is her practice at discharge.
Now, did you testify when Ms. McGuire was asking you questions earlier today that you took into account the testimony of Kevin Tolson and the testimony of his sister, Corey Elaine Tolson, in rendering opinions in this case?
Yes, I did.
What do you mean by when you say you took that testimony into account?
In forming my opinions, I included all depositions, family and medical staff, and the medical records.
But to what extent, ma'am? How did you take that into account? How how did you use that testimony in reaching your opinions? And I'm talking about the testimony of Mr. Tolson and the testimony of his sister, Corey Elaine Tolson.
Objection to form.
So, yeah, you're asking for a process by asking how.
Right. You said you took it into account. I want to know how you used that testimony in reaching your opinion.
Again, objection to form.
In reaching any opinion, I look at all the evidence in the depositions as well as the medical records.
Yeah, but how did you use Mr. Tolson's testimony and his complaints at the hospital to the nurses and the testimony from Miss Corey Elaine Tolson where she said he felt his foot was cold to the touch? How did you incorporate that into your decision-making process to reach an opinion? Did you give it any weight? Did you give it little weight? How did you use that testimony? How did you account for that testimony? That's my question.
Okay.
Objection. Asked and answered. You asked the same question several times in the first part of her deposition, and she fully answered those questions then. So, Ms. Halstead, it's up to you as to whether you want to continue to answer the same question over and over again or whether you just want to say, whatever. It's up to you.
Ma'am, you have to answer my questions, please.
You don't have to answer questions that you've answered before.
It's because you asked her the question today. That's why I'm following up with this question. You asked her whether she took those depositions into account, and I'm following up with that. So, Ms. Halstead, please answer my question.
She did. She said she did.
No, I want to know how she took that into account. How did she use that testimony? You got to explain it to me, please.
You've already answered it, Ms. Halstead, but if you want to answer it again, you can.
Okay, I can simply say that Mr. Tolson's complaint of a cold foot and a numb foot was a subjective complaint that can occur with any type of traumatic injury, but it was not documented objectively by the medical staff that there was any neurovascular impairment of his leg.
So you concluded from the medical provider's examination of his leg that his foot was not cold to the touch?
No, that's not what I said. To him, his foot may very well have felt cold and numb, which can occur when there's a traumatic injury due to several factors. One being that there can be some damage or temporary damage to the nerves in the area. Swelling can cause symptoms such as that. In addition, the ambient effects, it was December, so it was winter, cold outside. He'd had ice on that leg. That foot may have been exposed to the ambient temperature in the room. So there are many factors that can explain that he truly did have, to him, a cold foot and a numb foot.
Okay. Do you believe that Mr. Tolson actually complained to the medical providers who saw him on December 3rd, 2009 in the emergency room that his foot was cold to the touch?
Yes.
Objection.
You can answer.
Yes, I do believe that.
Objection. It's not a question about whether she believes him or disbelieves him. It's a question of whether she considered that testimony in reaching her opinion.
Yes.
Which she said she did.
Ma'am, can you answer? Did you believe one way or the other whether Mr. Tolson told the medical providers his foot was cold to the touch? Did you reach any conclusion with respect to that testimony?
Yes, I did believe him. If I did not believe him, I would not have incorporated that into forming my decisions.
Right. And I believe your conclusion was that the medical providers actually considered Mr. Tolson's subjective complaint that his foot was cold to the touch, did their own evaluation, and concluded objectively that it was not cold. Do I have your testimony correct?
Objection. Misstates her testimony.
Yeah, that's exactly what you said when you asked her the question. Ma'am, is that your testimony?
Objection. Misstates her testimony.
Does not. Go ahead, ma'am. You can answer.
My testimony is that the medical staff determined that his neurovascular status of his foot and leg was intact.
Does it also mean that you believe they concluded his foot was not cold to the touch?
Objection. You've asked that question, and she's answered it at least 4 times. You do not need to answer that question again, Ms. Halstead. You can rely on your testimony.
Ma'am, is there any evidence in the chart that the medical providers actually wrote a complaint for Mr. Tolson that his foot was cold to the touch anywhere in the chart?
P.A. Shaw mentioned, let's see, in her, she's on page, she mentioned that he had paresthesia. And I'm just going to her assessment to be accurate.
I'm talking about anywhere in the chart, does it reference Tolson made a complaint that his foot was cold to the touch? Is that written anywhere in the medical chart?
Which is what she's answering.
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Halstead, look at page 11 of Exhibit 4. I think that's what you were just answering.
Yeah, page 11 and 12. Mm-hmm.
What's the answer to my question again?
P.A. Shaw said he complained of numbness and paresthesia.
Do you interpret paresthesia to mean that Mr. Tolson's foot was cold to his touch?
No.
Well, back to my question was, I'm trying to figure out if you saw anywhere in the medical chart where a medical provider wrote in the chart that Mr. Tolson complained that his foot was cold to the touch.
No, I do not see that mentioned.
Had made that complaint to any nurse, physician's assistant, or physician, were the nurses or physician assistant or the physician required to make a notation of that complaint in the chart?
I'm going to object. You're now asking her questions that you've already asked her with respect to the nurses. She does not need to answer those again. And now you're asking her questions about what a physician or a physician assistant is required to do under the standard of care. She testified clearly in the first part of her deposition that she was not giving any opinions and would not be testifying as to the standard of care for physicians or physician assistant, Dr. Jackson or Ms. Shaw.
I join in that objection.
You do not need to answer that question again, Ms. Halstead.
Ma'am.
You've already answered it with respect to the nurses.
No, you didn't. Ma'am, if Mr. Tolson made a complaint that his foot was cold to the touch to Nurse Craddock, the triage nurse, was she required to make that notation in the chart?
Objection. You do not need to answer that question. It's already been asked and answered.
Ms. Halstead, are you going to answer the question or not?
No.
Okay. Ms. Halstead, if Mr. Tolson made a complaint to Nurse Weiss, his foot was cold to the touch, was she required to make a notation of that in the chart?
Same objection.
No.
No, she was not?
No, she would be required to either notify a doctor or make her own examination.
Okay.
And
if Mr. Tolson had informed Nurse Stell that his foot was cold to the touch, never mind. If Mr. Tolson had complained to the triage nurse that his foot was numb and he couldn't move it, is the triage nurse required to make a notation of that in the chart?
Again, objection. Rodney, you are now redeposing this witness. You've asked her all of these questions in her first session of deposition when you asked her questions for 2 hours and 40 minutes. This is not the purpose of us finishing today. She's already answered these questions.
You went over ad nauseum for the first half hour, all the breaches of the standard of care, why she didn't believe the nurses breached the standard of care, and I get a chance to go over that again.
Rodney, I did my questioning based on the fact that you have been quite clear in all of these witnesses' depositions that you wanted to hear what if they were going to give an opinion that they had not yet purposefully expressed in deposition. You had not asked her those questions the way I did, and therefore I wanted it to be absolutely clear to you that Nurse Halstead held the opinion that Nurse Weiss and Nurse Craddock and Nurse Stell and any other nurse that saw or took care of Mr. Tolson in the ED did not breach the standard of care, in her opinion. It was an important thing for me to make clear to you because you have been asking each one of these people if they were going to say anything in addition to what they had said to you on your direct questioning. So I was trying to be fair to you. I was not reopening all of this ad nauseum. You are now re-asking questions that you have already fully covered with this witness, and that's not fair.
You did go over all that, so the question stands, Ms. Halstead. If Mr. Tolson reported to Nurse Craddock, the triage nurse, foot was numb, was she required to write that in?
Objection, breadth, lack of time, lack of any kind of factual evidence in which I believe this witness could answer that question.
Go ahead, you can answer.
I'm just not comfortable answering a hypothetical question in this regard.
Well, ma'am, it doesn't really matter if you're uncomfortable answering it. You're an expert. I get to ask hypothetical questions. It's a simple question. If Mr. Tolson had reported to the triage nurse that his foot was numb at the time of triage, was she required to note that in the charts? It's a simple question.
Objection, asked and answered. You do not need to answer that again, but you can if you choose to.
And a lawyer can't tell you not to answer a question. So
Didn't say that.
I'll be cautious. I'll warn you about that. Now go ahead, ma'am. Are you going to answer my question or not?
On the hypothetical, if a patient complained of a foot being numb in triage, that nurse is required to document that or to discuss it with a doctor.
Ma'am, is it your testimony that the triage nurse did not have to make an inquiry of Mr. Tolson as to how he injured his leg at the time of triage?
Objection, asked and answered.
She determined the mode of injury. It was not required of her to determine the mechanism of injury, including all the details of how it happened.
And is it because you believe that another provider along the line would get that information from Mr. Tolson?
Objection.
It's because I believe that the paramedics did inform the triage nurse more details of the mechanism of injury. It's not required that she document that in the chart. But in making her triage decision, she may have taken that into account.
Is your opinion that the triage nurse did not have to document the mechanism of injury, is that supported by any guidelines, by any nurses associations that you're a member of?
Objection, asked and answered.
She documented the mode of injury, and in a triage situation, that is adequate. Which
I'm trying
means
to figure out, are there any written guidelines that support your conclusion that the triage nurse did not have to write the mechanism of injury in Mr. Tolson's chart at the time of triage?
Again, asked and answered several times in several different ways during the main part of your deposition in February.
Go ahead, ma'am, you can answer.
You can choose whether or not you want to answer that question, Ms. Halstead, because you've already answered it.
Right.
Not answered to that degree. Go ahead, ma'am.
According to Emergency Nurses Association, all that the triage nurse is required to document in the chart is the chief complaint.
Was Nurse Stell required to remove the splint from Mr. Tolson's leg for assessment?
Objection, asked and answered in the deposition starting on February. You can answer again if you choose to.
No, she was not required to move the splint
Would it have been a breach of the... have removed the splint Tolson's leg as part of her assessment?
I'm sorry. Mr. Gaston, I didn't hear that full question. Can you repeat it?
Would it have been a breach of the standard of nursing
Full question.
as part of her assessment? Have removed the splint Tolson's leg as part of her assessment?
I'm sorry. Mr. Gaston, I didn't hear that full question. Can you repeat it?
Would it have been a breach of the standard of nursing care for Nurse Stell to have removed the splint from Mr. Tolson's leg as part of her assessment?
Objection.
Yeah. And the answer is it depends on what type of splint it is.
Tell me, what type of splint would result in a breach of the standard of care if Nurse Stell had removed it from Mr. Tolson's leg at the time she did the assessment?
Objection, and I am going to instruct you, ma'am, that you do not need to answer that question. That is completely unrelated to any issue in this case. There has been no allegation by anyone in this case, including plaintiff's own experts, that there was a breach in the standard of care by any nurse caring for Mr. Tolson in failing to or removing the splint. That is absolutely not an issue in this case, and I'm advising you that you do not need to answer that question. I can't tell you not to answer it, but I'm advising you that you do not need.
Ma'am, you can answer the question.
And I will choose not to answer.
Okay. And as far as I know, you still don't know the type of splint that the paramedics put on Mr. Tolson's leg, correct?
Asked and answered.
And that is correct.